Welcome back, everyone. Have you ever been pulled over for speeding? If so, did you ask the officer, "Officer, can I get off this one time? Can you make an exception?" But what if the officer let everyone get away with speeding? Would that be problematic? In general, do you think that we should allow exceptions for rules, even moral rules? Or should they be exceptionless and absolute? When you judge a moral action, do you look more at the outcome, or do you look at what goes into the action, what the person intended to do? Do you think if you thought deeply enough, if you ruminated, if you thought philosophically, if you philosophized enough, that you could reason out the moral rules and the moral laws, much like we can reason out axioms in math and logic? These are the sorts of ideas that we're going to talk about today, and we're going to get the help of a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant. Let's jump into it. Remember last time we were talking about utilitarianism. For the utilitarian, the object of our moral behavior is to maximize good consequences. When we're at our moral decision point, the path that we should choose is the one that will have the best outcome, is the one that will generate the most happiness or utility for all those affected. And remember all those problem cases for the utilitarian? The trolley problem, the Nielsen's cave thought experiment, the do intentions really count for nothing thought experiment, the Pope researcher case, Rachel's peeping Tom, Nozick's experience machine, Ursula K. Le Guin's Omelas. Well, the good news is that the moral philosophy that we're going to look at next, it gets around all of those problems. A lot of people like utilitarianism. However, there's a litany of problems that it faces. So one advantage of going with Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy is that we avoid many of those problems. The central principle in Kant's moral philosophy is called the Categorical Imperative. The Categorical Imperative. And if we're thinking clearly, it's a moral rule that anyone should be able to deduce or reason out. Let's compare Kantian ethics to utilitarian ethics. Remember, for people like Mill and Bentham, when we judge actions, it's supposed to be solely on their consequences. We don't look at what went into the action. We don't look at what the person tried to do, what they intended to do. For Kant, it's the opposite. We don't care about the consequences at all. We judge the action solely on what went into it, on the intentions of the person performing it. We don't really have control over how things play out. We have much more control over what we try to do. So that's why we should focus on intentionality, says Kant. Mill and Bentham's utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism because of the focus on consequences. More generally, consequentialism is a sort of teleology. Telos is the ancient Greek word for end, goal, or purpose. So naturally, consequentialism and utilitarianism focus on the end of an action. Kant's ethics is counted as a form of deontology. So the root there, deon, stands for duty. Sometimes Kant's ethics is thought to be duty-based ethics. Reason is really important for the Kantian. Like I said before, if you're thinking clearly, you should be able to reason out right from wrong. For consequentialists, morality is grounded in an empirical finding, an empirical observation about human beings, that we seek pleasure and we want to avoid pain. For Kant, there are duties and rights that we are never allowed to violate. The rules are absolute and exceptionless. A utilitarian is pro-rights insofar as those rights are a vehicle or a pathway to happiness, but if you can generate more happiness by violating someone's rights, that theory seemingly would allow for that rights violation. Kant's ethics gets pretty complicated. If you ever wonder whether or not doing something would violate the categorical imperative, ask yourself, what if everyone acted that way? Would that be problematic? Would there be chaos, or would disaster ensue? You know, I was watching this comedian, Louis C.K., and in the middle of one of his stand-up specials, he tells this joke, and after I finished watching, I thought, was he a philosophy major? What he just said, that essentially is the categorical imperative. So let's watch.
But see, this is a terrible realization, because you should act in a way that if everybody acted that way, things would work out. You should, because it would be mayhem if everybody was like that. And most people kind of don't care. Most people are very selfish. Most people don't give a shit what happens as long as they get to do their favorite thing. People don't even want to back off from their favorite thing. They won't even do their second favorite thing. Like, you ever seen somebody like they're at an intersection and they want to make a left, but they're in the right, all the way right lane because they messed up. So now okay, here's the guy. He's in the right lane, and there's a lot of cars, like 6th Avenue, like a lot of cars, and he wants to make that left. So what does he do? He just does it anyway. He just goes ahead and he just shoves his car through everybody's life without any... And everybody's beep, honking and outraged, and you always see the guy go, I have to. There's no other possible thing I could do. What else could I do except go up one more block and then go left and take 4 seconds? That's not my favorite way, though. That only meets 99% of my criteria.
The key line is, you should act in a way that if everybody acted that way, things would work out. It would be mayhem otherwise. That's a paraphrasing of the categorical imperative. Now, I've been dancing around this supreme moral principle, so let's state exactly what it is. There's different versions of it, so here's one of them. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. Now, that's quite a mouthful. Now, if you're trying to wrap your head around that, ask yourself, what if everyone did that? You should act in a way that if everyone acted that way, things would work out. Because there would be problems and chaos and mayhem otherwise. So compare this to the principle of utility, which is the chief moral principle for people like Mill and Bentham. Roughly, it's do whatever leads to the best consequences or maximize happiness for everyone affected. And more precisely, an action is morally right if and only if it maximizes expected utility for all affected sentient beings, again, taken collectively or taken as a group. Crudely, Kant's moral principle states that you're not allowed to do something that you wouldn't be willing to let everyone do. So, for instance, would you allow everyone to speed on the highway? You might want to drive 85 instead of 65, but would you be okay if everyone drove 85 miles an hour? Probably not. So then why should it be okay for you? Same thing with promises. Every once in a while, it would be convenient if we could lie, or if we could be deceitful, if we could break a promise. Now, would you be okay if everyone were allowed to break their promises? If not, why should it be okay for you? So you're not allowed to make exceptions for yourself. And here's another important component of this moral philosophy. Not only is it immoral, morality is deeper than that. It's also irrational to act in these ways. It's not just immoral, it's irrational. Because you're simultaneously believing that a rule is good in general, it's good for everyone, but at the same time, you don't think that it should apply to you. So you believe that it's good for everyone. If it's good for everyone, it should be good for you. You are one of everyone. But then you simultaneously believe that the rule shouldn't apply to you, so that it's not good for you. So there's the contradiction. The rule is a good one that should apply to everyone, but it also shouldn't apply to me. There's a logical inconsistency in that thought process. Let's go over some more examples to clear this up. So the traffic example that was mentioned in the Louis C.K. bit. We're trying to cut across lanes of traffic so that we can get in the left turning lane. And if we imagine everyone driving like that, it would lead to accidents and chaos and would cause the very traffic that we are trying to avoid in the first place. Here's another example. Cutting in line. Let's say you're at the store and you're in a rush and you see an opening in a line, let's say. The people in line aren't really paying attention and you can just kind of slip in unnoticed and cut in front of a bunch of people. We might be tempted to do this, but if we allowed everyone to cut, that would defeat the very purpose of the line. The line would be destroyed, and the purpose of the line is to create order to avoid that chaos of having no line. If there's chaos, then it would take everyone much longer than if there were a line. Look at this image, a bowl of Halloween candy that says, "Take one, Happy Halloween." So I remember trick-or-treating as a kid, and every once in a while there'd be a house where the people weren't home, but they still wanted to participate in the holiday, and so they'd have a bowl of candy, and it was kind of serve yourself, and the people were trusting the kids to not just empty the bowl, the entire bowl, into their sack of candy. Now, more often than not, I would see a big empty bowl, and I would see the sign in front of a bowl that is completely empty, and I would suspect that someone took more than they should have. Is it morally okay to take more than one, to take the whole bowl? Well, if everyone did that, then there wouldn't be enough candy to go around, and that's the point of the bowl in the first place. And this fourth example, this bottom right, it's a picture of a movie theater. So when I was in 7th or 8th grade, during the summers, me and my friends, we would go see a movie, like a matinee, because they were cheap. We'd go see a movie at 2 or 3 p.m. And then when we'd get out of the movie, it would be 5 or 6 o'clock. And, we had this big epiphany. We left the movie theater not the entire movie theater, but we left the movie that we were in, and we're in the hall, and we had this moral dilemma. We could leave the entire theater, but then there are all these doors that go to all these other movies that we haven't seen, and no one's really paying attention. So we call this movie hopping. You could pay for one movie and then go to a second one. Now, it doesn't seem like there's too much harm in that. It's just some kind of juvenile fun. But if everyone did that, it would lead to problems and chaos, because eventually there would be too many people in a movie theater and people who bought tickets wouldn't have a seat. So when we think this way, it seems to be a rational method of deducing right and wrong. We shouldn't do things that would undermine the very system that we find ourselves in. We shouldn't have the attitude that these rules are good, they should apply universally, but that they also shouldn't apply to me. So again, let's look at this first formulation of the categorical imperative. It's sometimes called the formula of the universal law of nature. Again, it goes like this. It's kind of a mouthful. It originally was written in German. Kant is a German philosopher, so it's translated from German. Act only according to that maxim. We're going to talk about what a maxim is. Essentially, it's a little personal rule of thumb, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. And then in brackets there, parentheses, I added without problems. So can a rule work universally without this chaos ensuing? And then here's the tweak. Here's, if we were to update it in more plain language, I think this would be a pretty good paraphrasing. You should act in a way that if everyone acted that way, things would work out. It would be mayhem otherwise. So I said a maxim is a little personal rule. Let's get more precise about that. It's a subjective principle of action. Essentially, it's a rule that you can act on. And Kant writes it has this certain form. So you find yourself in some circumstances, call them X. You're going to do something, call that action Y, and you have some goal, and that's Z, in order to achieve Z. So in circumstances X, I will do Y in order to achieve Z. So for instance, when I get important mail, I will open it alone to not jinx the news. So I had that superstition, especially growing up. When I would get important mail, I didn't want to open it in front of everyone. And when I was growing up, I shared a room with my little brother, and I would have to find spaces in the house that were unoccupied. And I got so OCD about this that eventually I would just leave the house, and I would I'd go around the corner, or go to a park or something where I could open up this important mail, because I thought if somebody were watching me, it would somehow jinx the mail. And if I was, and I remember getting my SAT scores or college acceptance letters, I wouldn't want to open that in front of everyone. I wouldn't want to open that in front of other people. But there's a circumstances, there's an action, there's a goal, right? The circumstances is I've gotten the important mail, and the action is opening it, and the goal is I don't want the news in the mail to be jinxed. Have you heard of Curb Your Enthusiasm? Well, there's a scene in season 10 that I think has a Kantian flavor to it. Let's watch. There's a link to the video in the description below.
How's the coffee?
It's good.
It's good.
Yeah,
good. You know, it's interesting because I was in my car earlier, and all of a sudden I hear a siren, and I look in the rearview mirror, and there's a fire truck behind me, and wow, a fire! And I better get over to the side of the road. Those guys are really in a hurry. I pull over to the side of the road, and it goes past me, and then I pull in here, and I see the fire truck. Where's the fire? Where is the fire?
We need a coffee.
Oh.
We don't do it often.
No.
Like, it's not a frequent thing.
You abused your siren.
Abused our siren.
You siren abusers. I completely get it. I had a handicap placard once, and I could only imagine what it's like to have a siren. Because that handicap placard, that was fantastic. Enjoy the coffee.
Old Larry, the show is just still hilarious after multiple decades. But there are these siren abusers. So they were violating the categorical imperative. They wanted an exception. They wanted to use the siren for personal gain and not because of an emergency. But if all the EMTs and firefighters and police officers did that, that would lead to chaos and disaster because people wouldn't pull over for sirens anymore, and then the emergency crews wouldn't be able to get to where they need to go to put out the fire, to address the person who needs the police, or help people who are injured. So that's an example of a violation of the categorical imperative. And you can see Larry David thinks of himself as a very principled person, and he is acting from this sort of Kantian sense of duty, even though he might not call it that. But you can see that this way of thinking, or this approach to morality, it does seem to be embedded in society in many individuals. So Kant is onto something. You could argue that he started a movement that people picked up on, but probably he just observed something that is a part of human nature, or a part of the way the world is, morally speaking. In the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, so that's one of Kant's most important works on ethics. He goes through 4 examples to demonstrate how you use this categorical imperative. So one of them is about promise breaking. One of them is about suicide. So you can see here, top left, this person is suicidal. Bottom left is about not letting your talents rust, so practicing when you're good at something. And then in bottom right is not helping people in need. So let's go through these 4 examples, starting with promise breaking. It would be nice if we could break promises when it was convenient for us. However, of course, if no one kept their promises, if deceit were allowed, deceit and dishonesty, that would lead to all sorts of problems. I mean, we couldn't even have a class like this. I might say, I'm going to make this video and publish it at this time, and then you need to watch it and take a quiz at this time. And then you go to watch the video, and then it's not published, or I just put up a video that says psych or something, and then the quiz is there, and you have to take it, and it's like, wait a second, there's something not fair about this. Or think about dishonesty between nations. Think about during the Cold War, leaders of the world essentially said to each other, I know that we are antagonists to each other, we're sort of enemies, but you've got nuclear weapons, we've got nuclear weapons. How about we agree that we won't nuke you as long as you don't nuke us? If people were allowed to lie, then the whole world might have been destroyed in a nuclear holocaust. So lying violates the categorical imperative. And the same thing for suicide. Now, this is an interesting one. People don't see exactly why this would be morally wrong for Immanuel Kant. Well, let's set up a maxim. So we need circumstances, we need an action, and we need a goal. So let's say the circumstances are you're having a bad day, and the action is suicide. You're going to kill yourself. And the goal is to avoid how annoying and the suffering of the bad day. So that's one solution, right? You would no longer be having a bad day if you committed suicide. Now, if we try to universalize that maxim, would that lead to problems? Yeah, it would. Our whole species would die out, right? I mean, everyone has a bad day. Eventually, everyone would eventually kill themselves. And if that's not chaos, then I don't know what is. So suicide is going to violate the categorical imperative. Now, what if the circumstances were a sort of end-of-life situation where someone has a week left to live and it's just going to be filled with suffering? Would the categorical imperative allow for suicide in that case? Well, that one you might be able to universalize. But Kantian scholars, they'll disagree on suicide. Some say that this is an absolute rule and you're never allowed to violate it, even in circumstances like that. But I'll set that aside. Now, the bottom 2 examples are different. They're different because there wouldn't be utter chaos and mayhem, and how problematic universalizing these maxims, how problematic things would get if we universalized them. It's not at the same level as the ones up here. So for Kant, it's still going to be wrong to act on them. It's just not going to be as absolute. So it's always going to be wrong to lie. It's always going to be wrong to commit suicide, at least when for having a bad day. But when it comes to not giving to charity or not working on a talent, it's going to be sometimes okay to not give or to not practice. And the reason for this is because we don't get that strict of a contradiction here. In fact, we get a different kind of contradiction. In the top two examples, we get a contradiction of conception, and in the bottom two, we get a contradiction in will. So what's the difference? Well, we start with our test. If everyone acted in that way, would there be problems or even chaos and disaster? Or you could think of it this way. Would trying to act in that way undermine what we initially wanted to do? In the cutting in line example, if we allowed everyone to cut in line, that would undermine our initial goal, which is to get in and out of the store as quickly as possible. If either of these things would happen, if it would undermine what you were initially trying to do, or if there would be these serious problems and chaos and even disaster, then acting on that maxim entails a contradiction in conception. However, take the charity case. If people didn't give to charity, would society collapse? I mean, it might not be a society that we would want to live in. It's a very selfish society, but it still might be able to function at a basic level. Same thing for the talents case. If people didn't work on and develop their talents, would society be able to function on a basic level? Now, we wouldn't have sports or the arts, because to have those things, people need to practice, right? We wouldn't have the NBA because no one's working on their three-point shot or their layup ability. We wouldn't have symphonies and orchestras because to have those, you need people who practice. We wouldn't have any concerts altogether because you need people to practice. We wouldn't have the Olympics because people need to practice. We wouldn't have football and soccer and the ballet, etc., etc. But we still might be able to meet our basic needs and have a society. In the top cases, society could not function. In the suicide case, everyone kills themselves when they're having a bad day. There is no society to even function. And then we said, clearly, if lying is allowed, then things will fall apart very quickly. We couldn't even have small things like having a class like this, and then big things like agreements between countries to avoid a nuclear holocaust. So if society could still function on a basic level, then acting on our maxim, it doesn't entail a contradiction in conception. Instead, it entails what Kant calls a contradiction in will. And what that means is, so society still could function on a basic level. However, it's not a world that we would want to live in. It's not a world that we would that we would want. It's not a world that a rational person would choose to participate in. So here's the specific language in the groundwork that speaks to this. Kant says, some actions are so constituted that their maxim can't even be thought of as a universal law of nature without contradiction. So like the maxim, I'll commit suicide when I'm having a bad day, or I will lie or break a promise when it's convenient. So that's going to lead to that strict contradiction. That's going to lead to problems and chaos and lead to a society that can't even function on a basic level. it's easy to see that an action of that kind conflicts with the stricter or narrower absolute obligation or duty. With other actions, now we're going to be talking about the talents case or the charity case, the maxim made universal law is not in that way internally impossible or self-contradictory, but it is still something that no one could possibly will to be a universal law of nature, because such a will would contradict itself. There's the world that a rational person would will or would want, and this isn't that. This goes against what the rational person would will. So that's the contradiction in will. When we go through more examples, it should become clear when we have a contradiction in conception or when we have a contradiction in duty. So to recap, the promise breaking or lying in general and the suicide case would entail contradictions in conception. Same goes for the movie hopping or the Halloween take one candy case or the cutting in line case, either cutting in line in traffic or at the grocery store. So all of those would lead to problems, chaos, disaster. Society couldn't even function on a basic level. And so we have a contradiction in conception. So there are duties that are connected to the different kinds of contradictions. If we have the contradiction in conception, then we have a perfect duty to not act on that maxim. In other words, it's always wrong. So it's always wrong to break promises. Always wrong to commit suicide, at least just for having a bad day. Always going to be wrong to cut in line at the grocery store or in traffic. Always going to be wrong to movie hop. Always going to be wrong to take more than one piece of candy when the sign prohibits this. Now, in the charity case or being lazy about our talents case, we don't have a contradiction in conception. We have a contradiction in will. And instead of a perfect duty, we have an imperfect duty. So this means that it's sometimes wrong to act on the maxim, but sometimes it's okay, it's morally permissible. And I think this makes sense. So think about this example. Let's say that you are at the grocery store, you're checking out, and you're about to tap your card or insert the chip to pay for your groceries, and then on the little screen it says, would you like to add $1 or $3 to your bill that will go to some reputable charity? And if you're like, I don't mind admitting this, that more often than not, this person who teaches ethics and moral philosophy, what do you think I do most of the time? I hit not today. So I'm just like you. I do it sometimes, but not always, which I think is, just as an aside, that's just fascinating. If Kant's philosophy made it obligatory to give every single time I go to the grocery store, that would be asking too much. That would be above and beyond the call of duty. That would make, there's this word, supererogatory. It's a fancy way of saying above and beyond the call of duty. So you don't want to make what is saintly, let's say. You don't want to require the average person to be saints. That's asking too much of them. So it's going to be sometimes okay to hit not today. But if I went my whole life and I never helped anyone else when it comes to neediness or charity, if I always hit not today my whole life, then I probably have lived an immoral life. So at some point you've got to help. And same thing with the working on our talents. People can have a multitude of talents. Do they need to work on all of them? Or do they need to spend all of their free time working on their talents? That would be asking too much. Think about a teenager and their parents. The parent says, you can't just be on your phone and play video games when you get home from school. You gotta do something. And so the kid says, well, I like music. I like the drums. And so the parents buy him a drum set. And then a week later, you know what's going to happen. They're sick of the drums and they want to play the flute. And the parents, they're like very flexible, very good parents. They go and they get them a flute. And then a week or two later, the kid's like, I'm tired of flute. I want to be on the swim team. And so buy them goggles and a Speedo and then go to their swim meets. But then 3 weeks later, the kid's like, I hate swimming. And the parent, if they, they probably, most parents wouldn't put up with this, but this is like an idealized parent. And the parent or parents, so eventually the kid's like, I don't want to do anything. I just want to be on my phone, go on TikTok and play mindless video games whenever I'm not, actually I want to drop out of school. That's all I want to do. And the parent would say, look, you don't have to be a drummer. You don't have to be a flautist. You don't have to be a swimmer, but you got to do something. So eventually it's going to be a waste of a life. It's going to be immoral in Kant's eyes for you to never work on a talent. But does it mean that you have to work on every individual thing? No. All right, let's do a little historical showcase on Immanuel Kant. So like I said, he is a German philosopher. And in terms of the history of Western philosophy, Kant is probably a top 10, maybe even top 5 philosopher of all time. He didn't just make breakthroughs in ethics, he made breakthroughs in almost every area, every major branch of philosophy, including metaphysics and epistemology, the philosophical study of reality and knowledge. And particularly in the modern era of Western philosophy, Kant might be number 1. And as we'll see, his philosophy is often at odds with David Hume's, who lived a little bit before Kant. But even though they disagreed, Kant had a lot of respect for David Hume and said about him, quote, he awakened him from a dogmatic slumber. So isn't that quite nice? So how exactly do Kant and Hume differ? Well, in an earlier lecture, we learned that for David Hume, it is the emotional, passional desire part of our mind that grounds morality. And it's not so much the belief, reason, thinking, rational side of our mind or our psychology. So that means that for Hume, morality is tied to desire. Kant disagrees. He thinks that it's great if you want to do the thing, wonderful, but what about when you don't want to do the right thing? And isn't that actually what happens more often than not, is we know what the right thing to do is, or we think we have a sense of what the right thing to do is, but we just don't want to do it. We need a system of morality to deal with that sort of situation. So right and wrong are often independent of desires. So Kant makes a distinction between two different kinds of imperatives. Of course, the supreme moral principle of his moral philosophy is the categorical imperative. But in general, categorical imperatives are things that you should do irrespective, regardless of whether or not you want to, regardless of desire. So categorical imperative, capital C, capital I, we looked at the first formulation of that. So remember, that is act only according to that maxim that you can universalize without problems. But in general, categorical imperatives, lowercase c, lowercase I, things you should do regardless of desire. And yes, the categorical imperative, of course, is something that you should do regardless of desire. So the lowercase ones are a subset of, they can be derived from the capital C, capital I categorical imperative. Then there are some things you should do not because they're your duties. You should do them just because you want to, because you have a desire to do them. So for example, if you are thirsty, then you should go get something to drink. Now, is that a moral imperative? No, but it's a hypothetical imperative. It's something you should go, right? If you are thirsty, then that's something that you should do to satisfy that desires. So for Immanuel Kant, morality is not a system of hypothetical imperatives. It is instead a system of categorical imperatives. David Hume, this language came after him, but if he were to use the language of Kant, he would likely argue that morality is a system of hypothetical imperatives because it is connected to desire invariably. And that's because he buys into this psychological thesis that human beings, we just never act on purpose without a desire. So those cases where you know what the right thing to do is, you don't really want to do it, but you do it anyway. For Hume, that is an example where there are multiple desires. There's a desire to not do the right thing. Take a soldier case where they're in one of those huge military aircraft or helicopters going over a war zone, and they're like a paratrooper. They're supposed to paratroop down and go right in the middle of the war zone and fight for the cause. And right before they jump, they get scared and you're like, I don't want to jump. This is crazy. I want to curl up in a ball and just stay on this helicopter and tell it to take me home. They know at some level that this is cowardice and that it's not just a good thing, it's a morally good thing. It's their duty, right? They agreed, they signed up for this, they agreed to it, and so they need to jump down into the jungle, let's say, or the desert, and fight the good fight. And at the last moment, they muster up their courage and they do it. And did they do it because did they really want to jump? They might say, no, I didn't want to. That's the last thing I wanted to do is jump out of this plane or this helicopter. So what made you do it? I just knew that it was the right thing to do. I relied on my training to give me the strength to do it. So Kant would say, aha, that's an example of a categorical imperative, and that person acted on it. It's an example of what Kant called pure practical reason, where you act from a belief or reason alone, even though there's no desire. Now, someone like Hume or a contemporary of Hume named David Lewis, they might say, you just haven't told the whole story of desire. Yes, there was a desire not to jump, but desires can be complex. They can be sophisticated. You can have two desires that are pulling you in different directions, and that's obviously what they would say is what happened in the case of the soldier. They simultaneously had a desire to jump and not jump. The desire not to jump was very strong, and they could feel it in that moment. We're going to see David Lewis is going to call that a warm desire. But if the person jumped on purpose, then someone like Hume or Lewis would say there has to be another desire there, because that's just an empirical fact about human beings, that when we act, there's always a desire there. And so the desire, it maybe isn't as warm and it doesn't feel pleasurable in that moment, but it was something like a desire to do the right thing, or a desire to defend the cause, or a desire to help out the fellow soldiers that are down there and are in desperate need of backup. So that's what someone like Hume or Lewis would say about that. All right, let's transition now to another version of the categorical imperative. So if you thought that this was already way too complicated, let's complicate it some more. Why not? There are multiple versions of the categorical imperative, capital C, capital I. Kant thought that they were morally equivalent. A lot of people will go through this one and you'll say, this sounds like an entirely different principle. How could this be equivalent in any sense to the first version? Well, Kant thought it was. So let's go through it. This is sometimes called the humanity formula, and it goes like this. Act in such a way as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of anyone else, always as an end and never merely as a means. So again, that's a mouthful. Again, it's translated from German from centuries ago. But essentially, people are agents. They have agency. They're rational agents. We're special because we can reason in a way that no other non-human animal or being can reason, and we deserve dignity and respect. Because of this, we're autonomous, You can't violate someone's dignity. Don't exploit people. Don't use people. You have to respect people's rights. You can't treat someone as a mere means. And the word mere here almost does all the work. So, think about the Fat Man case, and that the twist on the trolley problem case when we talked about Thompson and Philippa Foot. So the utilitarian, they might be forced to say that it's morally okay or even morally good to push the fat man off the footbridge to block the train from running over 5 people. But for most of us, that sounds, that our intuition is that is immoral. And that might be because in that, when we think about that thought experiment, the Kantian side of our moral psychology comes into play, and there's something that doesn't sound right about using this person as a even though the outcome is good. We're going to save 5 people's lives, but if we have to violate the humanity of someone, by throwing them off a footbridge and letting them be run over by a train and being killed, then that is not justified. So even if, you certainly can't violate someone's rights just for fun, So let's say a sociopath or a serial killer came along and wanted to torture the fat man just they get sadistic pleasure out of it, and so they push him off the footbridge just to watch him get run over, and they get this weird sadistic pleasure out of it. So certainly that's not justified. Not even the utilitarian would be on board with that. But the Kantian will say that even if the violation of the person's rights, even if the sacrifice of the life results in something really good, like saving 5 other innocent people's lives, you're still not okay. It's still not okay to act on that maxim. Still not okay to treat that person as a mere means to some end.